Ruthless Compassion is a podcast that shows you how to become fiercely kind. I'm the host, Dr. Marcia Sirota, and in each episode, I get into it with experts and regular folks about the things that get in the way of what we want. Things like addiction and mental health, isolation and loneliness, difficult family and work relationships, and the importance of self-care. I want to help you overcome the obstacles to living your best life, and I want to inspire you to become a powerful kindness warrior. Emily Esfahani Smith writes about culture, relationships, and psychology for The Atlantic, New Criterion, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, Daily Beast, and other publications. A native of Zurich, she grew up in Montreal and lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Welcome, Emily Esfahani Smith. Welcome, Emily Esfahani Smith, to the Ruthless Compassion podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me.
It's really a pleasure. I've been reading your book, The Power of Meaning, Crafting a Life That Matters. It's just recently out, and it's really a wonderful read. Can I ask you what brought you to writing this amazing book?
Well, thank you so much, Marcia. I think there are really two different answers to that question. The first one goes back to my childhood in a way. So I grew up in a Sufi meeting house in downtown Montreal. So Sufism is a school of mysticism that's associated with Islam. And our house was a place where Sufis came twice a week to meditate for several hours in the evening. So they would sit on the floor and classical Iranian Sufi music would be playing in the background, and they would just close their eyes and kind of repeat a mantra as they, focused on growing closer to God and how they could lead a more meaningful life through doing that. So part of their practice was meditation, but they also were very much devoted to practicing loving kindness and doing acts of service. And so I think, growing up, I was surrounded by people who were leading really meaningful lives, who were devoted to being loving and of service and to growing closer to God or this, whom they understood as this kind of ultimate reality. And then as I got older, I began to wonder, do you have to have some sort of spiritual or religious path in order to lead a meaningful life? And initially that question took me to studying philosophy in college. And then I realized that philosophy wasn't really dealing with questions of meaning anymore, even though for thousands of years, the question of what is a good life had been its driving force. Today, academic philosophy is much more engaged with kind of specific and esoteric questions that have very little to do with how we can lead good lives. So studying philosophy didn't really bring me the answers that I was looking for. And eventually I realized that psychology, and in particular a field called positive psychology, which is the science of human well-being, had kind of picked up the question of what a good life is and how we can each lead more meaningful lives and be happier, and had added this kind of backbone of social science behind it. So I studied positive psychology in graduate school, and this kind of brings me to the second answer to the question. So while I was a student in the positive psychology program at the University of Pennsylvania, I started noticing that, our culture has this kind of obsession with happiness. And, at the time it seemed like, every time I navigated online or went into a bookstore or just was, living my life, that I was getting this barrage of information about how you should be happier, and these are the 5 or 10 steps towards being happier, and that if we were happier, that we'd be more successful and more attractive and wealthier, and all of these things. It was as if the point and purpose of life was happiness. But as I reflected on that, I realized that there were so many people in my life, from the Sufis who I knew as a child to the teachers and nurses who were my friends, who weren't necessarily focused on happiness, but were still leading really meaningful lives, even though some of them, their lives were difficult and they were dealing with hard emotions and had devoted themselves to kind of stressful purposes. And yet, even though they weren't happy all the time, their lives had worth. And I realized that what it was that their lives were meaningful and that they were pursuing meaning. And so I got very interested in this idea of meaning and how it's different from happiness. And it became clear to me that meaning is ultimately what we're all striving for, and that happiness has become a little bit of a distraction from that pursuit.
It really makes sense to me, because I see it in my practice all the time, that the more people seem to pursue happiness, and you say it in your book as well, the more they pursue happiness, the less happy they seem to be. It's like the dog chasing its tail, right?
Right, exactly. It's our culture has this kind of obsession with happiness, but there's this Viktor Frankl quote. Viktor Frankl is a Holocaust survivor who wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And he says that, happiness cannot be pursued. It must ensue. You must have a reason to be happy. And that's certainly what I discovered researching my book, that when people pursue meaning and devote themselves to some sort of purpose, that they ultimately will experience kind of a more long-lasting and complex form of well-being. Whereas if they just chase happiness, it's kind of this endless pursuit that doesn't really get them what they're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Well, this may sound like a simplistic question, but I would really like you to define or distinguish happiness versus meaning, because I think, people don't necessarily understand what it means to have or to pursue a meaningful existence.
I think that's a great question, actually. And I think that a lot of people, myself included, when I was first starting to think about these concepts, I think a lot of us conflate happiness and meaning, and we just assume that a happy life and a meaningful life are kind of the same thing, but they are indeed different. So psychologists define happiness as a positive mental and emotional state. And activities that make us happy, according to the research, are things like, playing games or going shopping or sleeping in, things that are, make us feel good, basically. If we feel good, we tend to be happy. If we feel bad, we're unhappy.
And it sounds like there are things that are easy and fun, not challenging or difficult.
Exactly. That's right. So they kind of bring us comfort. They're enjoyable. They induce, pleasurable, positive states. But meaning is bigger. So it's defined as connecting and contributing to something that's bigger than you are. And when psychologists ask people what makes your life meaningful, they tend to get responses like, contributing to my community in some way, raising children, being in rich relationships, having some sort of religious or spiritual path that helps me understand myself and my relationship to the world. So these tend to be more effortful pursuits. They demand a little bit more of us. They certainly don't always make us happy in the moment, but when we pursue them, we tend to be left with this kind of deeper sense of satisfaction and peace later on. So there's this kind of long-term form of well-being that comes with it.
That really clarifies it. I think I would probably add as well that being creative or productive can also give us a more meaningful existence, and being a contributor in a way, like a social activist or a person involved in really participating in the community, might also be a very meaningful way of living.
Absolutely. I think that's 100% correct. And if I can just add, so when psychologists ask people, when people tell psychologists that their lives are meaningful, it's because 3 conditions have been satisfied that kind of speak to your point. And the first one is that people think that their lives matter. In other words, they believe their lives have significance and worth. And that often comes from feeling like you're contributing or doing something creative. The second one is their lives are driven by a sense of purpose or some sort of goal that involves contributing to the world. And finally, they believe their lives are coherent, which is to say that they don't think of their lives as, just random and their experiences as disconnected, but they're part of a larger narrative that explains who they are and where they came from.
Well, it almost seems self-evident that that's what we should want. How do you think we got so far off track pursuing, I guess, gratification as opposed to meaning? Where did we go wrong?
Well, it's an interesting question, and it's kind of, I think it has kind of a long-term historical answer in a way, because there's this wonderful book by an American historian named Darren McMahon. It's called Happiness: A History. And McMahon talks about how in ancient Greece, in the classical era, that happiness and meaning were kind of concepts that went together. So happiness wasn't defined as this kind of positive, pleasurable state. It was defined as kind of a life of virtue and a life of meaning. And that over time, and particularly starting in the 18th century, there was this separation that emerged between happiness and meaning, where happiness became defined almost hedonically, and meaning was this separate thing that was more associated with the things that have been talking about, like effortful pursuits. So there's this separation between the two of them that's occurred. And I think that the reason why happiness has just kind of become the default pursuit today is that it just, it seems so obvious that that's what people want, that they want to be happy. And I think that, I certainly want to be happy, and I want the people that I love to be happy. But the question really is, not whether we want to be happy, but which of these two things do we set as our goal, meaning or happiness? And I think meaning is what we should pursue, because for one, it's just intrinsically more edifying, and also because it does lead to that form of happiness that we want eventually.
And like you said, happiness should ensue. So instead of pursuing pleasure directly, we pursue meaning. And one of the outcomes of our pursuit of meaning is a happier existence.
Exactly. That's right.
Well, let me ask you another question. So if we are pursuing meaning in our life, what might be some obstacles to doing that? Because, obviously pursuing happiness is pleasurable, and pursuing meaning might be challenging. So what might be some challenges for people in their pursuit of a meaningful existence, especially in this day and age?
No, I think that, so I've been giving a number of, book talks and presentations over the last couple of weeks. And one of the questions that's come up at nearly every single one of these presentations is the role that social media plays in kind of either obstructing or aiding our endeavor to lead a meaningful life. And I think that most of the time when that question is being asked, the implicit kind of assumption is that social media is making it more difficult for us to lead meaningful lives, because we're so tethered to our phones and constantly checking Facebook and Twitter or our emails that we're not actually engaged with the act of living. And I think that's certainly true. So in my book, I write about how there are certain pillars of a meaningful life, for, building blocks, for example. And there are 4 of them specifically. And I'll just mention 2 of them right now. One is a sense of belonging. So cultivating relationships and bonds with others in which you feel valued and you treat the other person like they're valued. And another one is transcendence, or these moments where you are encountering beauty or really feeling the presence of something much larger than you are, and feeling connected to that, whether it's, a sense of spirituality or God, or whether it's nature itself. And you can see how with those 2 pillars, that constantly being tethered to social media can really be a distraction, because, if someone's trying to cultivate a moment of belonging with you, but you're checking your phone, it's almost a rejection of that moment of belonging. Or if you're constantly checking your phone or on your computer, you're not going to really be as aware of the beauty and of moments of awe that you could be tapping into for meaning. So I think that, social media and technology is certainly one obstacle, but I do want to say that those, that we can also use social media and technology as a way to actually enhance how meaningful our lives are. So one of the people who I spoke to told me that, her purpose is helping put together her family genealogy and telling and gathering stories from her family so that she can put together this book that then gets passed down to her grandchildren and their grandchildren. And she's been able to do that because of social media. So she's been able to reach all kinds of relatives and family members who she otherwise wouldn't have been able to do. And therefore, social media is actually helping her lead a more purposeful existence and contribute this family history to her, children and grandchildren. And she can only do that. She's much more able to do that now because of social media. So I think it's a double-edged sword, the social media business, but it can certainly hinder meaning. But I think if we're intentional about it, it can also help us lead more meaningful lives. I think the other obstacle is just maybe not knowing how to go about leading a meaningful life. I mentioned earlier that when people tell psychologists their lives are meaningful, it's because they think their lives matter, are coherent, and have a sense of purpose. But the question is, like, how do you make your life feel those things? Like, how do you find purpose? How do you find coherence? How do you make your life feel like it matters? And that question is really what drove me to write my book, because I wanted to understand exactly what the building blocks of a meaningful life are. And I mentioned two of them earlier, belonging and transcendence. The other two are storytelling, or kind of crafting the narrative of your life to understand who you are and where you came from. And the fourth one is purpose, or having some sort of top order goal that contributes to the world around you. So I think that, the how of meaning can be an obstacle, but if you know that these four pillars are kind of the building blocks of a meaningful life, they'll help you find more meaning ultimately.
I agree with you. As you were talking, I was thinking about how, you started out talking about hedonism and the pursuit of pleasure. And I feel that a lot of people in our world today have a purpose, but the purpose is to pursue this gratification of certain pleasure seeking needs, accumulating money, accumulating power, accumulating fame, influence, possessions, as opposed to a purpose that may be more spiritual or higher or community based. Instead of having a purpose to contribute to the world, their purpose is to contribute to their bank account. Would you like to speak to that, to this kind of misplaced sense of purpose?
I think that's a really great point. And I would say that I certainly agree with you that for some people, their purposes are attached to certain goals that aren't very meaningful. What's interesting is that psychologists actually define purpose in a very specific way, which is this kind of, top order goal that involves making a contribution to the world. So if someone says that their purpose is to make a lot of money, in the psychological sense, they're almost using the wrong word. Purpose wouldn't really be the right word. Maybe it would be better for them to say, my goal is to make a lot of money, because purpose really does have this pro-social element to it. There's also research suggesting that, when people set these goals that are, so-called kind of extrinsic, like money or status, that they ultimately end up feeling less well-being and more likely to experience depression. So it's, that's another, aside from the fact that these goals aren't meaningful, they can also actually be bad for you, the pursuit of them.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I think that the more we are pursuing these extrinsic kinds of goals of just seeking more pleasure or more money or more power, I think we are becoming more and more alienated from the things that are going to give us a meaningful and also happy existence.
I think you're right. And I think that, it's so important to understand that meaning is really about connecting and contributing to others. So these other goals that you're talking about, like status and power and wealth, they're really about the self. And one of the distinctions between, a meaningful life and a happy life is this distinction between kind of self versus other. So people who are really focused on happiness and from maximizing their own happiness tend to be a little bit more self-oriented, whereas people focused on leading meaningful lives tend to be others oriented.
And I love that point because I've been recently reading a lot of research on happiness, which actually says that you're going to be a lot more happy if you give to others than if you take. You're going to be a lot more happy if you are making a contribution to others than if you have others contribute to you. And I think people have really gotten it wrong that whether you're looking for happiness or meaning, the more self-focused you are, it seems to me the more you're going in the wrong direction.
Yes, exactly. There was a psychology professor who passed away several years ago, but was very famous within the field of positive psychology. And his name was Christopher Peterson. And when he was asked several years ago to summarize all of the research on well-being, he did so in 3 words by saying, other people matter. So the idea is that it's not about you, it's about other people and connecting to them and making a difference in their lives.
It's funny because I think, especially recently, there's been a lot written, including by myself, about narcissism just after the recent United States events. And it strikes me as the narcissist would probably be the most unhappy person with the most meaningless existence then.
Right, exactly. That's right.
Well, another question for you on this topic of living a meaningful existence. You were talking about contributing to others and reaching out to others and creating connections. What happens when people, have spent time feeling isolated and disconnected and aren't very adept at having these connections? How do they start to reach out and create community for themselves?
So this is a big problem, and there's a lot of data suggesting that people are lonelier than they have been ever in recent history, that their social networks are getting smaller, that people have less close friends than they used to, that they're speaking to their neighbors less. It seems like in all of these, however you want to kind of slice it, all of our measures of social connectedness are declining. And research shows that when people feel lonely and isolated, they actually rate their lives as less meaningful. So there's a direct connection there between not being adept at social connections and leading a meaningful life. So I think it's a real problem. And on the other hand, I think that there are so many opportunities today to form community with somebody else. And I'll give 2 examples. One is, thanks to social media and technology, there's so many groups out there that we can connect with. So in my book, I write about a group of medieval history enthusiasts called the Society for Creative Anachronism. And these are people who were definitely, not the cool kids in school and who otherwise would have kind of a hard time connecting with people because their interests are a little off the beaten path and they're not the most, perhaps socially graceful. They're a little bit awkward and nerdy by their own admittance. And yet they have this community that they can connect with, and that for them is like family. I mean, some of them that I spoke to said that they go to 40 or 50 events through the community a year, and their friends within the community really are like family to them. So I think that there's so many unique communities out there that we could connect to now and that we could find thanks to the internet. The other really untapped source of community, I think, are small connections that we can make with other people who maybe aren't our best friends, aren't people that we see day to day, but are nonetheless connections that can be real powerful builders of meaning. So in my book, for example, I tell the story of one gentleman who has this morning routine of buying a newspaper from a vendor on the same corner in New York every single day, and that he and the vendor have this really positive interaction with each other every morning, and that for both of them, it's a very potent source of meaning. And so these kind of smaller micro connections, I think, are also opportunities for people to build a local kind of immediate community with one another.
And I think you're right. I think sometimes we try to have everything all at once as opposed to taking little baby steps and just working our way into a challenging situation.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think, even if we are lonely and isolated, we all are going to go to the grocery store and interact with cashiers or pass by neighbors, walking through our neighborhood, and just reaching out to others in those cases, even starting with just a smile and a hello, I think are kind of baby steps that we can take to build belonging with others.
I agree. And from, my perspective, I'm always telling people that instead of thinking of what they can get from others, they can start thinking of what they can do for others, and not by being a people pleaser, but by just participating in the community. So for example, if they have an elderly neighbor, maybe shovel their snow, or just help them down their steps on a slippery day or something like that, or go and visit and have a cup of tea. So by reaching out and just offering a little bit of oneself, there's a way to start making connections. So instead of saying, I have no friends, nobody's there to be there for me, you can say, well, I don't have a lot of friends. How can I be there for others?
Exactly. And I think that there's this kind of virtuous cycle there, because on the one hand, you're being of service to another person. So you're making their lives better, hopefully, but also there's an important aspect of meaning that's feeling needed by others and having a role to play in the lives of others and your community. And I think that what you're saying kind of satisfies that as well.
I agree. I think that it does feel really good to be needed.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was thinking also of compassion and the role of compassion in meaning. Would you like to say something about that?
Compassion is, I think, kind of the highest form of cultivating belonging with someone else. There's, I tell the story of the death of the Buddha in my book as a really wonderful example of compassion. So the story goes that he was kind of traveling through India during the last days of his life, and he came upon a little village, and an individual in the village, saw that he was the Buddha and decided that he wanted to kind of be as hospitable to the Buddha as possible and offer him a meal to eat. Well, the story goes that the Buddha knew that the meal he was being offered was spoiled and that it would make him sick and eventually kill him, but that he accepted the meal nonetheless because he didn't want to hurt this person. And so sure enough, he eats the meal and he gets very sick and he's on his deathbed. And even on his deathbed, instead of kind of thinking about his legacy or how much pain he's in or anything really about himself in these final moments of his life, he's thinking about the man who gave him the poisoned food. And he tells his servant to make sure that this man doesn't feel any remorse or any guilt about what he did, and to tell him that, one of the most important meals that the Buddha will ever eat is the meal that he has before he kind of goes to his final resting place. So even in the midst of all his pain, the Buddha was still kind of radically focused on this person who had caused his death, really, but that the Buddha wanted him to know that he was loved and that he was valued to the Buddha. And I think it's such a wonderful example of compassion and how being so focused on the other really is a hallmark of a meaningful life.
I agree. I absolutely agree. It brought to mind Matthew Ricard, who has been named the happiest man in the world or the happiest man on earth, but he doesn't really like that appellation, and I can see why. He'd rather probably be called a man who's trying to live a meaningful life as opposed to a man who's happy, because I think to him happiness is not the point.
No, exactly. And he writes a lot about altruism and service and how those are really gateways to a good life.
Exactly. I think maybe that's what we need to focus on. Rather than a happy life, we have to think about a good life.
Yeah, I agree. I think that a good life, it is a meaningful life, and that if that's what we pursue, then happiness may come, it may not, but even if it doesn't, then at least we know that our lives are kind of contributing to others and, mattering to others.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. we were talking about the pursuit of pleasure and what a problem that is. But I was also thinking about the other thing that I see a lot of people do, which is the avoidance of pain or discomfort or challenge, and how that also makes it very hard to have a meaningful or happy existence. Could you speak to that?
Discomfort and pain and suffering, I think they're part of the human experience. We can't avoid them. And I think the happiness zeitgeist has, in some ways, kind of diminished those types of experiences and emotions. But they're really important to really live in those experiences and emotions when you're having them, because they prompt deep reflection and they force you to kind of reach into your own humanity a little bit more deeply, to understand who you are and the kind of person you are, and to gain wisdom. There's a lot of research that shows that, when you experience adversity or even have some kind of traumatic experience, that you actually grow as a result of it. And I think that's very much part of leading a meaningful life, is taking those experiences of suffering and pain and kind of transforming them into these opportunities for growth. And I think if we're so focused on happiness, then maybe we're more willing to just dismiss those moments of suffering and pain, rather than kind of seeing them as opportunities to live more deeply and more meaningfully.
Exactly. It's like using those lemons to create a beautiful lemonade that enriches our life.
Yes, exactly. That's right.
Absolutely. And, the other thing I was thinking about as you were talking was how resilience is such an important aspect of living a meaningful life. Would you like to say something about meaning and resilience?
So as we were kind of talking about just now, you're not going to be able to escape from pain or suffering. They're part of human life. Some of us are going to experience pain and suffering in more abundance than others, but all of us will suffer at some point. And the question is, how do you suffer well, or how do you kind of bounce back from suffering and then move forward into a stronger, more bigger you? And that's what resilience is all about. And in my research and in the kind of psychological work on resilience, it seems that the people who are most resilient in the face of suffering have these 4 pillars of meaning that I mentioned earlier. So they have kind of, a sense of belonging, strong communities. They have a strong sense of purpose. They understand their lives in terms of a story, and they, have some kind of devotion to transcendence. And so those pillars are there, and they kind of help them weather the storm of the adversity more effectively. And then afterwards, the people who grow in the midst of suffering, they build up those pillars even further in order to grow. So there are many stories of people kind of experiencing trauma and then strengthening their relationships afterwards, because they realize that their relationships are the most important thing, or finding a new sense of purpose as a result of the trauma that then leads them to, lead more meaningful lives, or crafting some kind of narrative about the trauma that helps them make sense of it, or in the case of transcendence, deepening their spiritual lives in some way.
Boy, what you're saying is so beautiful. I'm very moved.
Thank you.
I thought of another thing as well. Lately, I've been writing a lot about the problems with people pleasing and being nice, and how being a people pleaser is really giving to get, right? It's being there for others, but really because you want love and approval from them. So it's giving to receive, and it's not authentic. You're not being authentic when you're a people pleaser, because you're trying to give the person what you think they want, as opposed to just giving out of an overflow of self-love and self-compassion. So I thought maybe you could comment on the role of authenticity in living a meaningful life.
Well, that's an interesting distinction between being kind and being nice. I like that. So authenticity, I think certainly if the way that I understand living a purposeful life and of finding your purpose, I think does relate to authenticity. So purpose, I think, is about, taking who you are and your strengths and your talents and contributing those to the world in some way. So if your strengths are, leadership and love of learning, kind of taking those and giving them to the world by being a teacher or something like that. So I think that authenticity plays a role there, because you have to know who you are and what you're good at and what your interests are in order to know how you can best contribute. I also think that it plays a role in storytelling, because so much of storytelling is about how you craft your own life narrative and how you understand yourself. And sometimes we have to kind of face truths about ourselves that may or may not be comfortable, but that ultimately facing them enables us to kind of grow and develop as a result of them. So I think being true to ourselves is also important as we tell the story of our lives.
Oh, absolutely. And, my Ruthless Compassion podcast is based on the concept of ruthless compassion, which the way I see it is we have to really face the truth about ourselves, others, and the world, but with this attitude of compassion so that we don't beat ourselves up for what we see, but we use what we see to motivate us to move forward and have a more meaningful life.
Exactly. And I love that. And I've been thinking a lot recently about the whole concept of self-compassion and the role that plays in a meaningful life. And I think it's what you're talking about, that we have to have kind of the clarity and the awareness to know that we can grow and the ways that we can grow, but without being so hard on ourselves that it becomes almost debilitating to do anything about our weaknesses, let's say.
I absolutely agree. I have always found that in my own journey, that being gentle with myself enables me actually to be more productive and to persevere and to bounce back in difficult times than if I were pushing and harsh with myself, as so many of my people that I work with are. So I'm always trying to support people in being more compassionate, more forgiving, more gentle with themselves. And I always say self-compassion is not self-lenience. Self-lenience is a kind of lazy attitude, but self-compassion is just gentleness and loving kindness.
Exactly. That's right. And I always have to, when I'm trying to practice it in my own life, I think it's important to remember that you would never talk to your best friend or your spouse sometimes in the way that you talk to yourself about your own failings and your own frailties. And so I think that we should take that attitude, of love and belonging and apply it to ourselves as well.
Amen. Amen. One last question before we sum up, which is, I was thinking about the role of personal responsibility, because I think that a lot of times we like to put the blame on other people for our hardships. We like to feel like a victim, a kind of helpless victim of our lives. We like to feel like, everyone is hurting us or against us or doesn't understand us, and we feel sorry for ourselves. And obviously that's going to make it very hard for us to have a meaningful existence. So I'm always preaching personal responsibility. What's your take on it in terms of having a meaningful life?
I think that personal responsibility is a very important part of leading a meaningful life. It's so central to it that they're almost, I think, indistinguishable. A life of meaning is a life where you're taking responsibility for yourself and the fact that you're here to contribute to the world, that you have duties that you're responsible for upholding. And, we mentioned Viktor Frankl earlier, and he talked a lot about how we each have a purpose that's unique. For one person, it might be, being a parent to a child. For another person, it might be writing a set of science books that only that person can write. And that whatever our purpose is, we have a responsibility to realizing it and to making it come into fruition. So I think that responsibility and meaning go hand in hand.
That's wonderful. Well, I could talk to you forever, but I think it's a good time to sum up. Where would people find you and find your book?
So my information about my book and about me are on my website, which is Emily Esfahani Smith EmilyEsfahanismith.com. And my email is emilyesfahanismith@gmail.com. And I'm always interested in hearing from people about their meaning stories and anything else. So, they should feel free to contact me through my website or through my email.
And just in case people didn't get it at the beginning, the book we're talking about and the subject we've been talking about in this interview is The Power of Meaning, Crafting a Life That Matters by Emily Esfahani Smith. And it's just recently available and published by Viking Press, correct?
Yes, that's right.
And just to end, Emily, do you have for our listeners a call to action?
Yes, I would say to set meaning as your goal and pursue meaning as opposed to setting happiness as your goal and pursuing happiness.
Well, that's a very nice, succinct call to action. And I'm definitely going to keep thinking about that more myself.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me here.
It's been a pleasure, Emily.
All right. Take care.
That was Emily Esfahani Smith, and I'm Dr. Marcia Sirota. If you liked this podcast, please subscribe and review it on iTunes. You can also sponsor me on Patreon at patreon.com/Dr. Marcia Sirota. And please sign up for my free monthly wellness newsletter at marciasirotamd.com. My new book, Be Kind, Not Nice: How to Stop People Pleasing, Build Your Confidence, and Discover Your Authentic Self, is now available on Amazon.ca and Amazon.com.